4. We're going to be going live. Okay, hello everybody. Good evening. I believe that we are live on the Metagenics Institute page. Wonderful to have all of you signing on and being a part of this discussion that we're going to have. We're kicking off this Facebook Live series on behalf of Metagenics, and it's called the Personalized Lifestyle Pearls, PLPs. And we have no greater guest than Dr. Jeffrey Bland to really take us into this whole realm of exploring personalized lifestyle medicine. So in this 30 minutes that we'll be discussing what we'd like to have as a topic, and this was something that Dr. Bland brought forward, was an article in the New England Journal of Medicine entitled "The Key Role of Epigenetics in Human Disease Prevention and Mitigation." And for those of you who'd like to have that article link, if you look at the Metagenics Institute page, you will see the link. You can click on that and you can get to the abstract. So welcome, Jeff. Good evening.
Wow, I can't tell you how fun this is, and great to see your beautiful face there, Dr. Minich, and have this chance to share some thoughts with people who are interested in where this river of health is flowing. So thank you.
Yes, it's always very exciting to talk with you. I feel that you've been such a pioneer in the field, and what you're able to do is connect the dots and really see into the future in kind of that visionary way. So I'm kind of curious. Let's get into this article a little bit about epigenetics. Why, we let you choose the theme and the topic for this particular session. So what was it about this article that drew you in, and what is it that you feel like most needs to come to light as we discuss?
Yeah, thank you. There's so many things going on right now. This is such a revolutionary time in human history. It's a time where we're getting convergence of so many different forces that are going to create a new culture, a culture that will accommodate 21st century living. And I don't think any of us yet know exactly how that's going to play out. For me, it's trying to set as best I can the elements in place for grandkids and kids that will follow after them, because I probably won't be around for all the outcomes that relate to the things that are going on right now. But we certainly are at one of those epic moments in human history as we watch really global transformation in human culture occurring underneath us. And it's a transformative, disruptive time with so many different elements of really anxiety, because I used to have, as you recall, a little sticker on my office door that said, "Get comfy with chaos." And in times of great transformation, there is chaos, and it's not always clear, and it kind of looks like wow, I'm not sure I really like this. But I think you have to be careful what you ask for, and that's what's going on right now. We're really witnessing a tremendous change in all aspects of human culture, certainly in medicine and healthcare and agriculture, environment, you name it. So let's go down to this, why I chose this article. Of all the various things we could have talked about, why talk about epigenetics? And I think for me, epigenetics really symbolizes something that has been on the minds of all of us, and that is we were born into a world, at least I was, with my 1946 year birth date, of the feeling of genetic determinism. And we were heavily ruled by Mendel's laws. I remember learning them, fairly early, even in grammar school, the concepts, or at least the rudimentary concepts of dominant and recessive characteristics. And that led us into this feeling that woe is us if we got the bad luck of the draw when the sperm met the egg, and there's nothing we could do about it. And maybe some people got a good luck of the draw, and others got not so good at luck. And that's a form of really eugenics and I think bigotry. Quite honestly, when you think about it, that there were those that were chosen somehow by chance to get better luck of the draw from their genes. And it could pattern your whole life as to how you see yourself if you think of yourself as having unworthy genes. Well, I could carry that conversation on into the social milieu quite a bit, but I'll stop there and move on into the biology, because there was this concept that we all were aware of. Waddington, the classic biologist, helped us to understand that. And I studied the textbook by Waddington on embryology, in which the concept was that every organism is derived from a single sperm and egg that meet. Not every organism, but any sexual organism. And those organisms then that have this compilation of the genes from their biological mother and father, that their traits are characterized by this union. And when we start thinking about that, we say, well, now, just a minute. If that's the case, then how did I end up from that single fertilized egg into some of those cells becoming nervous system cells, and some becoming heart cells, and some becoming skin cells, and over 100 different cell types in our body when they all came from the same fertilized egg? So there must have been some kind of process that differentiated these cells in their development. And Waddington pointed out this is the birthing of the concept of developmental biology and embryology, that as these divisions occur, the cells specialize and they become different types of cells that have different function, even though they all have the same message for every other cell. Well, that was, termed some kind of a epigenetic process, yet to be defined. Something was going on, but this is even before the 1953 Watson and Crick article on the double helix. And then later, as we started to understand genes better, people started saying, well, hold it, some of these genes have marks on them, chemical marks, like methylated marks or acetylated marks or various phosphorylation or ubiquitination. These marks or chemical marks that were different from different cell types. So they had the same software, but the conversion of the software into their expression function was modified by these marks. And we then call those epigenetic marks above the genome. And so now we start to say, okay, well, now I know why a liver cell can be a liver cell, even though it has a message for a heart cell and every other cell type. It's only going to express in its book of life those stories that relate to being a liver. Well, okay, that makes very good sense. But the question then came about, well, but what happens if you put those cells into different environments? Could they have different marks that would express different functions? And we awaited then for Randy Jertle and Bob Waterland to have the big aha for us when they discovered that these animals, when we're supplemented with methylating nutrients, the folic acid and the B12, the B6, and the betaine, that's if they would occur, these supplementations occurred early in the process of development of the embryo, that these agouti mice that were always fat, plump, had a fairly short lifetime, got diabetes, got cancer, were always white color fur, that suddenly the pseudo-agouti mice were born that had a much different fur color, and they were not getting fat, and they lived about 35% longer than their parents, and their genes were exactly the same in terms of the book of their life. But what were different were the epigenetic marks that regulated how those genes were expressed. In this case, it was the agouti characteristic and how it was suppressed, silenced. So that was like a huge aha to think, well, people said, well, we're not mice, we're people, but it opened the door for the understanding that maybe there are factors in our life that modulate how, in fact, our genes are expressed. So we go from genetic determinism to genetic plasticity. And let me just take a deep breath and worship at the altar of great social transformation, because this concept of genetic plasticity is as powerful in shaping a different view of the human being and him or herself than was the concept of Mendel or the concept of Darwin that occurred during the turn of the last century with natural selection and with Darwinian and Mendelian genetics. So now we have moved from the era that was with us for over 100 years of determinism to the era of plasticity. And once you open that door, the human potential can soar rather than being suppressed. And it can get rid of the bondage of discrimination, the bondage of poor luck of the draw, that I'm not worthy. And it can open the opportunity to recognize that we all as humans have untapped potential, that we just have to bathe ourselves with the white light of the right experiences to produce the magnificence of who we are. That is a magic transformation in society.
That is, Jeff, you said that so well. And in fact, it gives me goosebumps to think about it, because it really does put people in the driver's seat of their lives. It gives them the locus of control. One of the things that you said on stage this past week, you and I were at a meeting together, and I wrote it down. I quoted you. You said, our genes don't tell us who we are. It tells us, our genes tell us what our possibilities are, what we might become.
Yes.
And so the fact that we have the ability to vision out what we want to become, and it's almost like the quote from C.S. Lewis, that we may not be able to change the beginning, but we can surely change the ending.
Yes.
And that there is that capacity that you're speaking to. Now, one of the things, and I want for people that have signed on, and we've got a number of people watching, would love to have your questions come in for Dr. Bland. I think that'd be great to add to the engagement. And I've got a number of questions for you as well. One of which is, Ashley is saying, shout out for genetic plasticity.
Good for Ashley, yeah.
So maybe, Jeff, if you can talk a little bit about, let's start with nutrigenomics and testing. A lot of the functional medicine providers are testing patients for their SNPs, looking at single nucleotide polymorphisms, using that as a tool of empowerment. How can we best navigate the therapeutic encounter using genetic testing? Do you have any vision as to how you see that unfolding?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really, really important question because it's so easy for us to slip back into the old model of disease. And I'd like to think of our genome as being the keeper of the keys of our health, not the keeper of our bondage of our disease. And if you reframe your thinking around that concept to say there's more information on our genome about how we're going to live exceptionally than there is about risk to disease, then it reframes our perspective as to how we look at our genetic information. And if you think of how we are told when we do have our genes analyzed by whatever company we select, the data that would come back to us is pretty much surrounding disease risk. Oh, you have this amount of risk for tinnitus, or you have this amount of risk for psoriasis, or whatever it might be, 100 different conditions or more. And it's a fairly negative story. I mean, most of us really don't like hanging out with the concept of being diseased, I don't think. It's not like a real pleasurable thing. So there's an aversion really around genetic testing, and you see it when you talk to people, even in my own family. When I gave them a 23andMe kit a number of years ago as a present, they thought it was a joke, that many of them didn't even send it in because they were not that excited about getting bad news. But over the last few years, I found, because we've been now using the concept of ancestry and the concept of potential and the concept that there is more information that will tell you how you can be all you want to be in your genes than there is to tell you what you don't want to know, that concept then empowers people to inquire about this river of life that's given rise to us as a unique facet on the diamond of society. We are this unique facet that's never been before produced nor ever will again. It's a one-shot deal. That's us. And to think that there are all these things laying dormant that are talents and unique characteristics in our genome. So the first thing, this is a long-winded response, by the way, to your very simple question, but the first thing I believe is to get a person, when you are sitting with them and they have their genetic analysis by whatever company's done it, is to just get them think about what this means, that they are the product of millions of years of evolution to refine them to who they are. They're the product of receiving all these generations of natural selection, right? That we're getting the model better and better over time. They're really getting millions of. Someone said, "What's the biggest experiment that's ever been done in life sciences?" I said, "It's natural selection. It's been going on for hundreds of millions of years to make us the best we can possibly be in our environment. So now we just have to figure out what the environment is that makes us the best with those genes, right?" So it's a different task than saying, "Oh, I got to skirt around the edges of life because I have disease risk genes and I want to make sure my number is not called." That would really be very unsatisfactory. Rather than that, it's to be an advocate for the bright light of good health because we've got all this power locked in our genes. So that's where I would start, rather than the disease risk thing, which is a fear-based model that takes us right back to the things that we want to get away from.
Beautifully said. And what I'd like to do is to take what you just captured and now apply it to maybe something even more specific, which is methylation. You know, within functional medicine, it seems like we have this fixation on methylation. And if you, as you've said before, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So we go to get our SNPs tested. We want to know about MTHFR. We want to know about COMT. How do we best see methylation within the scope of empowerment and potential as you're speaking to?
Yeah,
And maybe
thank
that's
you.
what
Yeah.
Turtle was saying too, and what his research was about.
Yeah, I think that is a great, great example. So if we go back just for a moment and revisit that New England Journal of Medicine article that you were citing that they could download, the one that was, yeah, thank you, that one, the key role of epigenetics in human disease and health. That is a very, very powerful manifesto, I think, for this changing philosophy in healthcare. And it does talk about methylation and about the role of methylating nutrients and kind of applies to this nutrigenomic concept. But it reminds us not to just stop there and think that this is a be-all, end-all answer for everything. It's a part of our journey, right? It's another piece of information in this discovery of who we are as unique individuals. And I think that there is all sorts of good stuff that comes from knowing about methylating pathways and homocysteine and the nature of the betaine and B12 and methylfolate and so forth. But it's not the be-all and end-all. It's not the answer-all. We are much more complex than just our polymorphisms of our methylating nutrients, methylating pathways. So I think we take that as part of a process of information, and we couple it together with how we look at and feel and our history and our narrative and our timeline, the things that we learn about in the functional medicine strategy, and we put it together with how we eat, and we look at other variables, including the biomarkers in our blood, to see how they match up with the things in our genes, recognizing that our genes are not indeterminate and they're not fixed. They can be expressed in different ways based on different environments. So I think maybe it sounds like I'm making it more complicated, but I think what I'm really saying is it's fuzzy logic that we're trying to get to. It's not like just an analytic determinant is the be-all and end-all. Even for monogenetic illnesses, and this is I've been saying this for years and years, and I don't think I wasn't skilled enough to communicate this effectively, but I think now people are starting to see it, that even things like phenylketonuria or sickle cell anemia, these are conditions that we consider to be homozygous, recessive, potentially very serious SNP related mutations. But even those are modifiable in their functional capacity based upon the lifestyle that a person is living in. There are more and more studies coming. I mean, with phenylketonuria, we know that's for sure. If you have the infant on a phenylalanine restricted diet, they can develop their nervous system quite well. And by the time they get into their teenage years, they've kind of grown out of their phenylketonuria. They have a much more tolerant effect for phenylalanine or sensitivity to phenylalanine. So I think these concepts that we hold so dearly of genetic determinism and it just give me a simple answer is not the way life works. We have to be comfy with the broader aspects of pattern recognition, putting information together that's complex and I think it was Dr. Christy Hughes, I think, that introduced me to the book Simplexity years ago. And that's a very interesting term. Very complex information, and we distill it down into a simple kind of operative set of principles. And I think that's where we're moving today.
You know, Jeff, you have so much passion around functionality, and in our recent discussions, you've been referring to functional capacity, whether it's cognitive, emotional, physical, physiological. Maybe we've got our eye on the wrong target when we start to whittle into the weeds of genetics. And what I'm sensing just from my discussions with you is that perhaps we need to be looking at the end result. So we could have a SNP for MTHFR, but if it's not functionally debilitating and we're not actually seeing any outcome of that, is it relevant? Is it really something that we have to be considering as part of lifestyle medicine? So maybe you can talk a little bit more about functional capacity and how we need to navigate that space.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. I think that's a really a very good connector. So what is function? I think it's a really interesting point that you brought up, and if we cogitate and ponder on that, which we did way back when in the late 80s with a group of people that ultimately kind of birthed the concept of functional medicine. We talked about function as really being, as you pointed out, definable in three separate categories or quadrants. And that was physical function, physiological function, which are all those metabolic things that we study, the pathways and the networks and all those kind of alkali goop about molecules. And then there's cognitive function, and then there's emotional function. And I think you can pretty much basket everything in one or more of those characteristics. Now, you asked then what determines those? And I believe what has emerged as a central tenet of this whole new paradigm in healthcare is that somehow our genes, when they interact with our environment and lifestyle, produce an outcome called those functions. That is the simple new paradigm. It's similar to the paradigm that was evolving at the turn of the last century with Pasteur, the vector disease paradigm, which says a disease comes as a consequence of exposure to an organism that produces an infection, right? That's one model. For those that are not infectious diseases, however, we need a different model, like the chronic illnesses, heart disease, diabetes, arthritis, mental, dementias, and so forth. And that model is somehow the exposure to stuff in our lifestyle, some of which we selected and others which we didn't, coupled with our unique genes, gives rise to an outcome called our function. And we can quantify those functions. We can quantify physical function. There are all sorts of different tests you can do for muscular strength, endurance, and capability. And we can quantify physiological function with all these biomarkers that we're developing. And we can quantify emotional function. There's different ways of testing emotional function, as well as there are for cognitive function. So if you then say, what do our genes deliver into those things that we can measure? They have to be measured as our function. Now, that is a very different model, I believe, than what we were trained in medical school, which is you look for the diathesis of a disease, and you're looking for the series of signs and symptoms that give rise to ability to put a name on that, systemic lupus erythematosus or multiple sclerosis or whatever it might be. So you've got a name for that set of prodromal characteristics that are associated with a dysfunction. And generally that is something you might see under the microscope or see in a CAT scan. It's got some histopathology associated with it that you can identify and reproduce on an exam in cytology or histology. But in the case of these chronic illnesses, you are no longer able to always to see the overt pathology. You've got to look at the shades of function in order to understand them, like chronic fatigue syndrome or multiple chemical sensitivity or fibromyalgia. There's not really a great singular diagnostic criteria for fibromyalgia. You have to look at a complexity of symptoms. So to me, that's the place where we fall now with our concepts, is really into function.
Jeff, we've got a number of nutritionists that are live with us, and I think that for you and I, sharing with them an example of what you're speaking to on function as it relates to phytonutrients. Remember the article that we wrote back in 2008? And we talked a lot about, if you look at the 1990s, phytonutrients were seen as antioxidants, but now they're functional components of cells. Make the link of what you were just talking about now into the nutritional realm and space with phytonutrients, and how now even seeing those components in food as functional markers within foods and also within our own bodies physiologically.
Well, I want to compliment you. You ran by that very quickly, but as I said to you just recently, I think we will look back. The field will look back at that 2008 paper that you were the principal author and I was your co-author in Nutrition Reviews on the effect of phytonutrients in type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome. I think that is going to be a classic. I believe it is was the first paper that I can find that really kind of talked to the concept that these phytochemicals are intercellular signaling molecules. They are like the relay racers that pass the baton on from what's going on outside the cell to what the inside of the cell should be doing in response. And that relay race is the relay race of life that determines not only what kind of race you're running, but how effective you are in that race. And each of the families of phytochemicals has different influences on how it influences gene expression through what are called transcription factors. And so this was the marriage of complexity in the diet, your colors of the diet, and how that it influences gene expression and modifies function. It was a field theory. I mean, to use Einstein's concept that he was always in search of the unified field theory of how you could put macro physics and subatomic physics together and quantum physics into a singular model. This is kind of a similar thing, that we're talking about a convergence of ideas that gives rise to how eating food is speaking to your genes. And that was a concept that I can assure you I never learned about at all when I was in school. That would have been considered like antithetical to any thought if in the 70s or the 60s we would have talked about food as speaking to your genes. Now this model allows us to understand, for instance, that in type 2 diabetes, and I just read this interesting paper from Joel Dudley at Mount Sinai, in which he showed that type 2 diabetes is really multiple different conditions that all lump themselves together with a singular symptoms, but they're multiple subtypes based upon how those genes are speaking of that individual to their environment. He categorized at least 3 major subsections of type 2 diabetes, each one of which would require a different approach for remediation. Another paper that just appeared this week in a separate journal was actually able to differentiate 5 different subtypes of type 2 diabetes. So as we get more understanding, we see that these disease holders are really superficial and they're illusory, that each individual carries their own unique relationships, which might group themselves together to be called something, but it is their individual dysfunction that needs personalized, precise intervention. And diet plays a big role in how it speaks to the genes. So these are huge sand-shifting observations, discoveries over the last 10, 15, 20 years.
Very true. And thank you for giving us a tour of really looking at phytochemicals in this very new breakthrough way, because I remember it was you that was talking about food as information. Food is medicine, which we know from Hippocrates, but you were really the one, I think, that birthed the whole idea of food as information, that we're constantly signaling to our genes, and not just our genes, but our epigenes too, and how we're actually modifying our genes. So Jeff, we just have a couple of minutes. I know that we're just on for 30 minutes, and it's been great to have this high-level view. Maybe we leave the listeners and those that are on the call with us with a couple of takeaways about some of the epigenetic modifiers. I know that some people are asking about things in our environment. Do you see that there are maybe 3 different classes of epigenetic modifiers? Are we thinking maybe of toxins? How might you think about this scientifically, but then also clinically? What would we be thinking? Is that?
I think that is your question, as you often do, opens up a huge opportunity for exploration, and I love it because it's a great way to end this chapter of our discussion, because it opens up 1,000 more questions for future engagements with other personalities. But let me just give an insight into what you said. I'm more and more convinced that the metaphor of where we see ourselves, kind of my visual image, is that we are a receiver of information from the universe. And so you might think of us as multiple antennae pointed out to the outside world. And those antennae are picking up all sorts of things, electromagnetic radiation, things that we probably don't even fully understand yet, emotions and moods that we're perceiving that have some vibratory frequency that influence these receptors, as well as light and olfactants and chemicals and hormones and all these various factors. And we have specialized antenna to pick up all of those. They're called receptors. And they're located all over the body, but particularly on portions of the body that's exposed to the outside world, like our nose and our tongue and our throat and our stomach and our intestines and our skin. And there are all these receptors out there that are picking up information. And it's being translated into cell speak language, right? And the cell speak language is called intercellular signal transduction. And nutrients play a big role in how these signals are transmitted out ultimately to our book of life to express our function. Now, when you hold that model in your mind, you want to do two things, right? You want to receive the best message you can get. You want to be present in a loving, nurturing environment that gives you attribution as a human being and doesn't steal from you the most precious thing we own, which is our self-worth. And then you want to bathe your genes with those signals that come from the volitional things we can do, like eating, exercise, drinking fluids, exposing ourselves to company and spiritual growth and all those things. You want to bathe your genes in the information that's going to turn on epigenetically the white light of good health. And that is a construction of a health system that is antithetical and distant from the disease care system. The disease care system doesn't worry about those. It's triage based, it's fix and repair, it's highly technological. This model that I'm describing, which is a health system, frames a whole different future for another place where young women and men that want to give their years of service to good and make a good living will find new employment in a health economy of the 21st century. That's where we're going.
What a positive message to end on. You know, again, that genes are not deterministic. They hold our possibilities. And one of the metaphors that you kept coming back to is this bright light of health. And if we can continue to see our being in that way of being a beacon of light, Chris Young was on and he's thanking us right now. And he did call forth that quote of, really bringing forth the light of what we're about as a human being, rather than focusing on disease, rather than health, and risk, rather than outcome and functionality. I think that sets a whole other template. So thank you so much for spending some time tonight, Dr. Bland. It's been a pleasure. So many people are thanking us, and I think really appreciate your words and your wisdom.
Well, likewise, it's a reciprocal, and we are a part of a tribe of great transformation, and it's a privilege to be part of it. And I think the world that we're going to give over hopefully will be better than the world we came into. That's our objective, and we'll keep this conversation going. It's infectious.
Let's do that. Thank you so much. Have a good evening, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay. I think we had a lot of people check.